and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's discussion and conversation. And this event launches the Nottingham part of the National Being Human Festival of the Humanities, which takes place in over 50 towns and cities across the UK between the 15th and the 24th of November. And this year has events in Melbourne, Princeton, Rome and Paris as well. So it's become a truly international event with nice reflections on Brexit. So Being Human is the only national festival dedicated entirely to celebrating research across the arts and humanities, from archaeology to philosophy and creative writing and more. And the festival, which is now in its 5th year, is coordinated and supported by the School of Advanced Study at the University of London, the British Academy and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And nearly 100 universities, museums and libraries across the UK are organising activities. And the 2018 programme features around 350 free events. And the overarching festival theme this year is Origins and Endings. And the Nottingham Festival programme has seen the University of Nottingham, in partnership with Nottingham UNESCO City of Literature and with input from Nottingham Trent University and other partners, draw together a really wonderful programme of events under the umbrella title of Our Many Points of Connection. And that's focused on Nottingham's great tradition of cultural diversity, creativity and innovation. And we have a series of events exploring topics such as the First World War, the suffrage movement and women in literature. From old and new cultural exchanges to personal stories of losing your voice and finding your identity, this collection of events uses music, literature, and the power of words to explore origins and endings, renewal and rejuvenation. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, Sandy Mahal, who's Director of Nottingham UNESCO City of Literature, also my colleague, Leela Matsumoto, who's Assistant Professor in Creative Writing at the University of Nottingham, and extraordinarily bravely, Becky Cullen, who with 2 minutes' notice has agreed to join the panel. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks to you. Becky is a poet who's based in Nottingham. So, with the theme of championing women's voices, I'm going to ask the 3 panelists to say a little more about themselves, and I will warn them. I'm going to start with Sandy, then move over to Leela, and then to Becky, to say a little bit more about themselves and their work, to talk a bit about the women who have inspired them, and to say why literary prizes for women, they might say just prizes for women more generally, matter today in their view.
The role of literature and libraries and literacy has played a huge, significant role in my life, and particularly growing up in Derby. I am the girl from Derby, and I know some people often raise their eyebrows when I tell them that, but I'm the proud child, in fact, of immigrant parents who arrived in Derby in the 50s. And my parents were both illiterate, they couldn't read or write. There were no books in my house growing up, but the one place my parents allowed me to go to as a child that they understood as a place of learning and books was to the library. And so that's where I immersed myself in books and discovered Jane Austen and Edna O'Brien, the women that really inspired me through literature. And my journey actually throughout my career has been remarkably supported by the groundbreaking generation of women working in publishing, in literature, across the media and arts world. And I just know that I could not have got to this position without their support and guidance. And I have to say that if you find the right mentor, and I urge every single one of you to go out there and find a mentor, it's just invaluable. And why prizes for women matter. And I would have loved to have heard from Kate Moss about the founding story of the Women's Prize for Fiction 23 years ago. And this was at a time when a lot of novels were written by women, published by women, bought by women. And yet I remember, well rather Kate will remember, the year when the Booker Prize announced their shortlist, and there were no women on that shortlist. And I think it was a reaction to that, that the Women's Prize was set up as a way of highlighting and championing women's voices. And today I feel utterly honoured to serve on the board of the Women's Prize for Fiction, which is transforming into a charitable endeavour. And I'm really passionate about doing more with the prize outside of London, because a lot of literary activity happens in London, and it's partly the reason why Kate approached me to join the board, was to ensure that the Women's Prize was reaching many more readers across the country. And so I'm plotting many ideas for how we might bring the prize, the shortlisted authors, and indeed the winner, to Nottingham over the next couple of years. And I think it's important because even today in 2018, when you consider a lot of the movements, the hashtag #MeToo movement, the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, the huge shift that's happening in publishing when we talk about diversity, it still really matters that these voices are promoted, that the nation's bookshelves reflect the communities in which we live, in which we work. And so for me, that's why it's important, and that's why I'll continue championing women's voices.
Just a little bit about me, I suppose. I am originally from Japan. I moved to America. I don't know if you can hear my American accent. I moved to America when I was 6. I vividly remember learning English because I didn't speak for a year, very intimidated at school, but I read a lot. I remember the first sentence I ever said was, "Henry is always getting into accidents," which was in my English textbook. But I've always loved reading in Japanese or English, and I went to university in America, in New York, and then I moved to Scotland when I was 20, after working on a garlic farm. Not sure why I'm telling you all this, but because I loved Scotland and I loved Scottish literature, and particularly Nan Shepherd, who some of you might know her work. And yes, and then I did a PhD in Edinburgh, and I was writing a lot and started writing poetry. But I'm telling you all this, I think, because my personal mentor was someone who taught me at university at Vassar College, which is where I went to university in New York, and her name was Anne Mark. I don't think she's famous, but she she works for PEN America. So PEN is an association for writers working for social justice. They run a prison writing network. But until then, I hadn't really been aware of the kind of link between political activism and literature. And she was the one, she taught Creative Writing 101 to me, basically. And she really took me under her wing and just engaged in conversation about poetry and writing. And she offered me an internship actually at the organization, so I got really hands-on knowledge with that, and I did my dissertation with her. But she was the first person who really took interest in my thinking and my writing, and I was really inspired by that. So when I started teaching myself, I started teaching, I suppose, about 6 years ago. But I moved to Nottingham 2 years ago, so I'm not a local person. But her model really inspired me in terms of what literature is. It's not just a product, but it's a process of speaking to other people, especially women. Because I don't know about you, but when I was learning poetry at school, most of the poets that I read were men. There was Sylvia Plath, but apart from that, I don't think I actually encountered many male poets. So encountering other female poets, Elizabeth Bishop went to my university, so she totally inspires me. But yeah, so for me, my process of being educated is deeply tied to my feeling about women in literature. For me, women have really been the most inspiring people for me in terms of learning about new writing and inspiring me to write. At the moment, I'm for the last 2 years, actually, I've been on a mission to only read women writers, which sounds maybe quite strange. It's actually, in the beginning, I found it quite difficult, but now I love it. I love having that kind of challenge, which isn't so much of a challenge, actually. There are such amazing women writers out there. The second question about women's prizes, I think is incredibly important, and I was just talking to Sandy earlier about the history of the Women's Prize for Fiction. And I think for myself, prizes like this are incredibly important, but I'm also interested in how we can think about the infrastructure of encouraging women to write in general, not just at the prize stage, which is so important, because I think I would have been so inspired if I knew about this prize, and if women writers had won more prizes, I would have learned about them when I was younger. But I'm thinking about at school level. I mentioned I didn't really read about that many female poets, for example, or people who don't have access to learning about literature or writing. So at the moment, and I can talk about this a little later, I'm interested in kind of running or being part of initiatives that run workshops, particularly aimed at women who might not have considered writing themselves. Because I myself was always intimidated by poetry, and it was only until someone, my mentor, encouraged me to write. So I'm interested in how the prize structure links up to earlier stages of writing and workshopping and all that. Yeah.
To go to origins and endings then, I'm from Nottingham. Maybe I won't end here, who knows? But that's okay if I do. And I come more specifically from the Bermuda Triangle of Beeston, or NG9. But it's, yes, thank you, NG9ers. So once in NG9, very difficult to get out of NG9. It's got everything you need. So I have been away and I have travelled, but I have...
Well, you've been to NG7.
No, there's no need to be. Anyway, so yes, so I have been away, but I've always returned. So my perspective of writing and being a writer is that it's something that I've always done as a woman, which I've always done for somebody else. So when I graduated, I went into teaching, so I've written lesson plans and teaching materials and marketing documents for new courses and specifications, and then I went into HR, where I wrote HR guidance, and I wrote descriptions of new policies for people, briefing documents, etc., etc. And it wasn't until later on, I mean, I know that I look very youthful, but I use a lot of oil of Ulay. So it wasn't until later on that I decided to do an MA in creative writing. And I know it's sometimes popular to say, well, what can creative writing teach you about? What can a course teach you about writing? You know, this idea that writers are born, not created themselves, but also that somehow these creative writing courses are churning out the same types of writer. But for me, as a 40-something-year-old, it was very important to have that permission to write and explore writing as a woman. So, interestingly, my mentor, if you like, I think you sometimes think of mentor as a kind of a mother figure or a father figure or someone who's going to nurture you, or which is true, but someone of responsibility or age in your environment. But my mentor actually is younger than me. And so that's Dr. Sarah Jackson, actually Associate Professor now, Sarah Jackson at Nottingham Trent. And she has been an inspiration in the way that she writes and edits and pairs her poetry, and in the way that she's very resilient as well. Poetry is, you know, like, I'm sure I don't write fiction, so I can't say that poetry requires a lot of reconsideration, let's put it that way. Anyway, so in terms of prizes, I was looking at some statistics recently, and in the poetry world, so for example, in London, so does anybody access the Poetry Archive website? So they've got recordings on the Poetry Archive of lots of different poems by contemporary poets, and recordings of Yeats reading The Lake Isle of Innisfree, and it's all completely free, and you can just go and listen to any poem by any poet that you want to. Has anybody come across it? You're all fictioners. Yeah, so I was looking at that and the usage figures for that. So 60% of the people who use that website are women, and 40% are men. And it's the same. I've got a university colleague who works in poetry magazines. The majority of people who submit to magazines are men, not women. So there's an audience for poetry from women, but a lack of confidence in getting involved with the production of it in terms of publication. So that's why I think prizes are important for women, because it gives you a voice, a chance to be seen and visible and competing, you know, on your own terms.